Thank you very much, Ricky, for that, and Gautam, for both these sort of wonderful talks to open a conference like this in its sort of widest sense. And before we open it to the audience for questions, because I'm sure there must be questions, I just want to sort of start by saying it was really interesting to, in both the talks, to observe, well, commonality in terms of issues, but how they resonate sometimes in reverse. And the two that struck me, and I just would like us to reflect on it before we open it to the audience, was one, land ownership and holding, in the way you pointed out that the Olympic, because it was, and in Mumbai, that's what we're struggling with, because you have the Bombay Port Trust, or you have, different agencies and owners who are given land for a particular use, but there's a presumption that it can also be treated as real estate. This is kind of a fundamental tension, especially when you frame it with the commons. I really would like Gautam to reflect on what that means for the future and what it means in our democracy and the possibilities of it. Now we have the Bombay Port Trust, who are actually isolating that piece of land rather than stitching it in the way Ricky showed us with the Olympic Park. And the other thing that sort of struck me, Ricky, is I didn't realize the mayoral system, having a mayor, was such a recent thing in London. It just sort of, and because that's also been a conversation we've struggled with.
The Prime Minister before, Margaret Thatcher, abolished any leadership because she didn't like the guy who was running it, who then got elected to be the mayor.
So my question to you was, just for our understanding, what were the kind of the politics or the forces or the convergences that occurred that you came back to a system like that? Because that's something we've been struggling with as our cities get bigger, and in a democracy often that's very hard, at least, with the particular system we follow. And so it's votes in the village and money in the city is the kind of way we explain our dynamics. So just if you could tell us about the mayor, you could reflect on the idea of the commons and ownership.
The question of having an elected mayor for the city, at least for Mumbai, is something that, Charles spoke often about this, and it's something that recurs once every so many years, usually when we have parliamentary election and we've got some candidate who goes around saying, I'll do this for you, or whatever it is. The problem really is we have no system of control, accountability, and we really don't trust people in power. If you don't trust an entire corporation, are you going to put that kind of power in the hands of one man and have him stand for election? And that's the only accountability. It's much simpler for us to elect a corporation, a bunch of corporators, and let him answer to them, and then we'll see what to do with them every 5 years or so. That's really the problem, and that's the divide. We don't trust the individual to do something for the greater good. We've just lost that sense altogether in this country. It's also tied to this question of land ownership, where public bodies who are entrusted as custodians of land deal with them as if they're private owners. They use them to maximize profits. This is actually a fundamental flaw in government planning today. They will give you permissions to build all kinds of things because one of the conditions attached is that this is the amount of money that has to be paid to government. It shouldn't be. Then there is this entire question of having public services pay for themselves. Why should they? Why should public transport pay for itself? It should be subsidized. What is wrong with subsidizing a transport system or a sanitation system? I have never understood why Goa in particular, Panji and the two major growth centers, just have not evolved an effective waste management system. What's the difficulty? Why do the municipal corporations not get their act together and do this? Partly it's because it's a divesting of responsibility and it's a refusal to subsidize. It's part of that. The whole thing is just tied together.
On the land ownership issue, but all to say is that not everything, I think, needs to depend, in terms of successful urban development, on land being in public ownership. The image I showed at the very end is...
I'm not suggesting.
No, but I think that nonetheless the mayor plays an important role. The image I showed at the end, which I didn't talk about in detail as the last of the interventions, is a £3 billion development in the heart of London called King's Cross, next to 2 railway stations. And it's wholly and totally private. I could have used that example. You and I have walked there together, I think, not quite recently. I could have used that as an example of a relatively positive development in terms of many of the issues that we talked about, from a closed site to an open site and social housing, et cetera, et cetera. And that has been implemented simply because the regulations, both from the mayoral London plan, which trickles down to our what we call local authorities or boroughs, which have a scale of representation. I think that's probably one of the key points you were also intimating, whereby if your elected leaders or councillors don't do what you want them to, you kick them out. And you kick them out every 3-4 years. I mean, it's actually quite... But the influence of the mayor being able to lobby central government for funding to clean up these sites and do all the things is also important. So it works a little bit both ways.
You want to comment? No. Okay. So let's open it up and we can come back to this discussion. So if there are any questions...
Lights down a bit.
Yeah. And maybe you turn up lights there so we can see. And if you've got a question, just introduce yourself briefly so we know if you're a student, a professional, or... Yeah.
My name is Damu Radeshwar. I'm a Ricky Burdick student. I was. So the example that you just talked about, King Cross, private development, but it also did some public good because the development was sanctioned based on what they were going to offer to the city, like some affordable housing and some public spaces, etc. So today, as I was walking around here in Panji, I saw the new things that are happening here, such as the casinos and all, which I had not seen many, many years ago when I was here before. So I talked to some local people and I said, when casinos came about, what happened? Did they give any money for public good? Did they create any spaces for public use or anything for public? And they said, well, the money that they gave was pocketed by certain individuals. So the question is that what can happen? How can these things be done in the context of our cities in India?
I'm recusing myself from that question.
Yes.
Jeff Sessions.
You have to.
He has to recluse himself from that. So we'll treat that as an observation and take that on board, maybe for discussion in other panels. You want to...
I mean, I was struck, Damu, going to Detroit as part of this prize 3 weeks ago, which is a city which has hit the rock bottom, beginning to pick up. And unfortunately, one of the major areas of picking up in terms of regeneration is 3 massive casinos. And as far as I know, there's absolutely no contribution to the city economy, except that it means some people will go and spend long weekends there because they can play for 3. So there may be a trickle down, but there's no demand from the city because there's nothing to demand. Not a good model.
Yeah. And in many cities, in many cities, even development rights, the parcel-to-parcel linkages, where FAR is given, but with very strictly stipulated common good, which is about expanding a transportation line, all sorts of other infrastructure development.
Could you stipulate?
I think the problems is actually much larger, and it has to deal with Goa's tourism policy, and, or more accurately, a lack of any coherent tourism policy. It's quite staggering. The population of the state is, 17, 18 lakh people. This floating population is 5 and 7 or 8 times that. And there's no means of dealing with this. This is an industry, so anything that encourages this, and if casinos encourage it, why not have casinos? That's It's that rudimentary in logic and equally fallacious. It's not necessarily done for the betterment of an area.
Other questions? Yes. Let's take two. So one here and one back there, yeah.
Hi, I'm Geeta. So Ricky, my first question is to you. You showed a very nice last image of Shanghai. And you said this is not what we are talking about. But at the same time, it is so easy to replicate that. And that is what we keep seeing. And earlier, the image you showed of Addis Ababa or Lagos, where they are replicating it. And that's what we keep seeing getting replicated in many other South Asian countries also. So clearly, the word complexity is very important. So what are the other driving forces where flexibility and the kind of things that you've been able to do in London and during Olympics and the kind of concepts that Correa talked about is so rare. And those kind of models keep getting replicated. So what are the kind of other driving forces are we challenging these so-called sustainable concepts?
The second one too, please, if you could. Yeah.
I'm Professor Shashikant. I just want to ask, you're talking about equitable cities. Are we missing people in this? Whose cause we are fighting? Whether people are really pitching for the cause which Charles Correa might have fought for, like for Mills Land. Did the people come forward and support? Second, in the case of London, did people come for demanding housing for such thing and then you provided? What is the role of communities in bringing the equity? It is, since it cannot be one-sided effort of the planners, and the communities must be brought in order to join us in the equity movement.
A good point. And, much of that will be discussed through the conference, through other speakers. But it's a very important point that you've surfaced. So, Ricky, do you want to respond to Geeta first about the replicability?
I don't know whether there's a response. I agree. There is an ease to do certain things that serve certain interests, and I think that applies across the board, not just in development. It happens in hospital provision. It happens in aviation. It happens also. There's a line of least resistance. Give me a piece of land. I'll put in the infrastructure and develop it with cookie-cutter buildings, which cost much less per square meter than anything else. And if you can abstract it from, let's call it the democratic process, the political process, then I can get it done more easily and get bang for my buck. I think this relates partly to issues of ownership again and return on investment. I think Gautam rightly said, why should we be charging for certain things? That's a hell of a political statement, right? But many social democracies are predicated on exactly that process. And unfortunately, with the diminution of tax income at the local level, many of our, London included, by the way, is finding itself put into a corner. There's a whole part of South London along the Battersea, near Battersea Bridge, near the famous energy center, which basically the developers there have more or less doubled the density of development because they had to pay £100 million to cover the cost of the extension of the underground system, right? So, sometimes these processes can work in a negative way. What I found interesting in the project I didn't illustrate fully, which is private sector, but doesn't resort to cookie-cutter solutions, is the fact that long-term pension funds are now behind those sorts of projects. So they look to the long term in terms of what is done, and actually that adds the possibility for complexity over time. I don't know whether that's a specific answer to your question, but I think there are issues that need to be taken into account.
On the second question, this has always been a problem with the planner or architect either viewing himself or being viewed by others as God. It's actually inbuilt into our planning statutes, because all our planning statutes say a bunch of planners will sit down and prepare a master plan, a development plan. What is a development plan except 6 people deciding what's good for several tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people over the next 20 years? Now, the way we rectify this is that we have, in law, theoretically, a system of public discussions. Every proposal is placed before the public. You can't then say every citizen wasn't consulted, every citizen wasn't heard. You have to give the citizens the opportunity of making their voice heard. You have to hear them fairly. And that answers the question. Nobody is saying that the Correa Plan should have been imposed on people. It could not have been. But at some point or the other, when you made it law, it would have been placed before the public. Remember this, that when it is often placed before the public, an individual whose house is being rebuilt and who's being promised a larger house with an attached toilet and a bath will not want to look at a larger community concern beyond what he's getting. He's moving from 120 square feet to 500 square feet. He's moving from 15 square meters to 45 square meters. He is not going to look at, does this entire community have access to open space? Is the ventilation and light in this big tall tower, which is very close to other big tall towers, going to be affected? In 20 years' time, will my children's health be affected? He's not thinking that far ahead. It's unfair to expect him to. But it requires us to make a fair plan and then put that plan before the people and invite their suggestions. There's a process to it. Nobody suggested that Charles's plan would have been slapped onto the city without a legally mandated process. All I said was that you couldn't just throw it out of the window like this. That was the only point.
There's a question here. And sorry, there's one more there. Someone can take a mic so we can take 2 questions together, please. Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I have a question, an observation based upon what you were talking about, Ricky, about London. That when you have a strong central government which plans something, you get something like the original master plan of Delhi, which was in 15 areas. And today, if you look, all of them have great parks. And the parks are used by the ordinary people, whether it's Lodi Gardens or whether it's Nehru Memorial Park or whether it's the Deer Park or wherever you go. But that idea has just faded away in Delhi just now. This was the original master plan of 1961, which had very much the components that you described so beautifully about the redevelopment of East London at the time of the Olympics. To me, it seems that there's been a continuous dilution, and Gautam, this is also for you, a dilution of the role of the state in this. And the role of the state has not been, in the past, was not destructive. And today it's become very much a predatory situation where, in fact, the builders are taking advantage of it, and you're getting more and more of the sort of mess of central Bombay. That's one thing that's bothering me. How do we sort of bring back the authority of the state? Because if you don't do that, then architects cannot and town planners cannot interact. There's no forum of interaction. The other question one of you raised, and I think it's relevant because the Supreme Court has been asking the state governments to do this, is the whole question of urban waste management. I wanted to ask you, Ricky, there was a wonderful project that I read about several years ago where British Airways was collaborating with an American firm. And the idea was that they were going to convert about 600,000 tons of urban garbage in London into aviation turbine fuels, into diesel and aviation turbine fuels. For a long, it was called the Green Sky Project, and British Airways had already agreed to buy the aviation turbine fuel from it. This was, of course, revolutionary because it took the concept of garbage as a nuisance to be got rid of and turned it into garbage as a precious, very valuable resource. And then I think it may have been because of the oil price crashes, but nothing more. I heard nothing more about it. So I wanted to ask you whether you were aware of this and whether it's happening now, because it is beginning to happen. For example, there's a city in Texas where this is being done just now, and there are plans. I was checking out in several cities. In fact, basically, it's a question of gasification of garbage in order to get transport fuels out of it. Now, the idea, I hope you don't mind, I'll take just another 1 minute. Once the idea, we change the mindset that urban waste garbage is actually a valuable resource, then the situation that we have today in Delhi, where there are 153 drains which pours vast quantities of garbage, and mainly plastic, indestructible plastic, and they choke with it, and they've completely destroyed the Yamuna River, That plastic, all of it, can be removed and converted into all kinds of things, from natural gas, synthetic natural gas, and those technologies, I have been studying them for another reason. They all exist, and there were 200 plants like this coming up in various parts of the world. So, I mean, I would like to think of how you could sort of integrate, one, the centrality of power, and the other is, once you've got that power, to look ahead at technology and see what technology can do for you, because technology, I think, is also partly the key to doing this.
Thank you. I think let's take the second one.
Architect Poonam. Both of you, in my understanding, are coming to governance as the centrality to better planning and future of the city. My question to Mr. Patel, I'm going to take this advantage. 2006 onwards, we have been trying to get ourselves organized in Goa according to 73rd, 74th Amendment of Constitution. What is your experience and what do you think? How is this ever going to happen? Is there a future of equity connected with this amendment to the Constitution?
I thought those two amendments were actually grounded in equity, and that's why you have the opportunity to form yourselves and to make your voices heard. The whole panchayat focus from the constitutional amendments is necessary. It's an inevitable change. There's going to be resistance to it because it rocks the boat. It affects the existing power structures. So obviously there are people who are going to resist. It's going to, but it's a matter of time. And I don't think it's very long coming, where the voices of people who have gathered themselves together like this will be seen as serious opposition. It's going to be a difficult time. There's going to be violence in this, because the people who have assets, land and property and money are not going to, and control, they're not going to easily let go to a more democratic voice. So there's trouble ahead, I think, and I don't think the law is fully equipped to deal with it yet. Not yet. That's a more complex question. Well, the first part I can tell you. So the first part is rather simply answered. If you want a better government, you should stand for elections. We'll vote for you. That's the simplest solution, actually. I go beyond this. What can we do?
Unfortunately, I'm completely unaware of that very exciting development, and maybe someone in the room knows more about it than I do and whether that's happening in London. But I mean, you're getting at a much bigger issue, which is how does one harness innovation for the public good generally? And I think that is something which is certainly at the heart of our conversations, very, very broadly, because first of all, there has to be, your point, a political sense of the direction of travel. There are many cities around the world that are absolutely leading the way with some of the examples that you talked about. So Stockholm, for example, now has invested very heavily in a biochar system whereby they turn some of their rubbish into pellets, and the pellets get burnt and all that sort of stuff. But that comes from the culture of a city, Stockholm, not unlike Copenhagen, which believes that you can promote growth, demographic and economic, at the same time as reducing energy footprint per person. Right? That's quite a stretch, that. And we know what the Paris agreements, where they sort of... so I think it does go back to whether there's a sort of belief system which is shared, and then how can that actually be modulated, approved, or rejected by those who can have a say. But from the environmental point of view, London is not ahead of the curve, I would say. I think there's an aspiration from the current mayor to do something about it, but there's little innovation that I know of, except for transport and investment in so reducing car emissions and massive investment, £1 billion in cycle use.
Maybe we take one more question. Yeah. Okay, we'll take two because I know you've been trying for hard. So one back there and one here. And take a mic back, please, there. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Achit Sadhu. My question is that if people are grappling with this issue of equity as an abstract concept, when there are inherent structures or imbalance between power and knowledge, what are the metrics to quantify equity then?
Impossible to answer that.
Judge, I mean, we can't argue with the judge here. Okay, but you know, no, but yeah. So I mean, I don't think it can get so precise, but I can anticipate that in the many talks that we are going to see over the next few days, we'll see it from different perspectives, and then I think I mean, one of the things I'm going to argue for tomorrow is also scale. At what scale do you read inequity? And so there are many.
Let's hazard a definition. Inequity is what? That famous thing. Inequity is like a giraffe. You can't describe it, but you know it when you see it.
Okay, at the back
the closest
there.
You'll get.
At the back there, there's a question back there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anusha. So, what I want to ask is, what role does awareness play, like awareness of the general law? We don't know a lot about the land laws that you spoke about. To achieve the coherence that was talked about earlier, it's very necessary that the general public, especially the younger generation, knows about the laws and can react to them or probably ask for amendments publicly. So how can we bring this awareness into much grassroots levels and to all kinds of people, and what role does it play in making cities equitable?
First, there are lots of groups that are working on these public awareness campaigns, bringing knowledge. But that knowledge dissemination is about basic rights. It doesn't percolate to every nuance of the law. And I'm not sure that everybody needs to know necessarily every dimension of the law. Actually, in a city like this, when we're discussing equities, you have to be able to ask yourself whether what you see happening around you is right. There is just a sense of right and wrongness about it. You can then explore whether it is according to law or not according to law. Look, this is a very counterintuitive thing, and I'm saying it, so I'm saying it. The law very often has nothing to do with justice or nothing to do with equity?
I think the correlate of what Gautam has just said is very much the heart of the theme of the conference, but also we're taking an abstract notion into something very physical and very real, very concrete. And I think, we've used the word shaping cities, whatever. There is an intuitive sense of whether a piece of city works, and for more than one constituency. And that's where the complexity actually comes in, because the city is made up of diverse forces, just like a dinner party is, just like a football game is, and managing those forces is incredibly important. But I think you can see it with your eyes and feel it with your skin.
Okay, I'm going to allow that one last one, and then we'll...
Sir, this is Hiral Doriwala, town planner from Government of Gujarat. As far as the equitable cities is concerned, I think our last 5 years plans, that is 2012 to 2017, 12th 5-year plan was based on the fostering equitable growth. Now this 5 years plan is being converted into Niti Aayog, and MOUD, that is Ministry of Urban Development, Government of India, has fostered two main projects. The first one is the smart city projects all over the India, and second one is the affordable housing projects, that is PMAY, that is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, in which government has targeted its objective to provide the shelter to all the poor by the year of 2022. So as far as these equitable cities is concerned, so these two major projects will suffice these our objective, or still it's require policy level intervention?
Are you asking about whether these will be successful in delivering this? That's the question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we'll have to see, but I think all the signs tell us no. There's been a lot done and written. I think the State of Housing exhibition that some of us were involved with in Mumbai surfaced some of this. So, sorry? No, I'm not sure. No. So, that's a difficult question to answer. But, I think these have aspirations to do that, but clearly in the way they've been structured. And, I want to just go back to Geetam's point, because in a sense, it's also related to, what your question is. Because I think her question actually has a huge form implication. That was really the question she was asking. And I think Ricky responded to it. I think there are other dimensions, too, in terms of the way capital is organized and the way things are funded, the scale at which things are done, the least resistance. These are forms that are predictable. And the housing, the Pradhan Mantri Yojana, etc., have actually subscribed to these forms, which have no complexity. This is mass production. So it becomes statistical in a sense, which then you resort to a particular kind of form, which is that image that Geetam was sort of responding to, which lacks the complexity that Ricky was, because then it becomes a question of numbers. It becomes statistical architecture more than making place. And I think that was what, in a sense, I understood from Geetam trying to sort of provoke us to respond to. So, I think there are aspects like that. And I hope some of that unfolds in these conversations. I think the question of metrics, too. We might not have a precise metrics, but I think there will be lenses that I hope the speakers will provide us to look at it differently, so that our intuition about this, how it feels, actually gets sharpened and becomes more objective.